Good evening, everybody. Tonight we are going to be working on Unit 9 in our core shell, and I'm going to take us there. And you can see the topics for Unit 9 include technology called Web API and NuGet. And NuGet, of course, is the package manager that's built into the Visual Studio environment. It very simply is a tool that allows us to import pre-built libraries or functionalities into our projects. I'm not going to be lecturing you in this particular video. I do have an archive video that you can watch if you'd like. And you should also read Chapter 10 in your main textbook, where they not only talk about how that technology works, but also kind of guide you into building your own packages for either deployment or personal use, if you so choose. All right. Since our topic then is not going to be NuGet, it will be Web API in this particular video. And Web API is a really important technology that's kind of intermingled a little bit with MVC, because basically what happens in Web API is you use MVC type techniques in order to build a website. But technically it is really a separate set of technologies. And what I want to do is I want to show you a couple of resources first. And what I thought would be a really good starting point for you in terms of reading and exploration is I put a link here in the topics section to Microsoft's Web API site, which I have open on a separate tab here. At least I thought I did. All right, let's try that one more time. Maybe we'll just pull it up from the core shell. There we go. And you end up landing on this particular page here. So they do tell you um, a little bit about the technology. And one of the real key pieces to Web API is this concept of a restful application. And maybe you guys have heard that terminology before, and maybe you haven't. But let's Google it really quick and take a look at what that means. And and this is the actual meaning of the REST in terms of an acronym, and it stands for Representational State Transfer. And notice, let's just read what it says here from Wikipedia. Yes, Wikipedia. Because really it's more of an architecture, I think, more than the actual tool, so to speak. So it's a style that defines a set of constraints to be used for creating web services. Web services that conform to the REST architectural style provide interoperability between computer systems on the internet. RESTful web services allow the requesting systems to access and manipulate textual representations of web resources by using a uniform and predefined set of stateless operations. Other kinds, such as SOAP, okay, so they kind of go into this thing. Now, let's just talk about that whole concept of a stateless protocol, right? One of the problems that we have with HTTP, unlike working in a regular operating system, is that we don't have the ability on HTTP to maintain representational state. So in other words, we can't tell if a user is logged in just by using the browser and by using HTTP. Usually we need server-side interaction in order to make that happen. The Web API and the RESTful API give us some tools to be able to do that without having the protocol to match. So we're leveraging the existing protocols to basically make it do what we want. That is kind of a way that I look at it. The other thing that happens quite a bit with this is the technologies that it works with. So it does work directly with HTML, and you notice that there's also a way that we can pull information back in various formats. And a real big movement right now, it used to be that XML was the big way to move the data. And now we're seeing that we can use HTTP itself, and more importantly, we're using JSON quite a bit. And if you guys have ever seen JSON code, it's basically key value pairs in JavaScript, with curly brackets around it and comma separated values. And it's become such a popular way to move data. I'd say it's almost become primary these days, and it's used heavily in this technology. If you read deep into this, this really started out with more of a conception than anything else, but the whole point is to be able to create applications that behave more like real applications on the web and allow for more instantaneous intercommunication between the client and the server. A lot of times putting that processing burden really back on the client, but we still have that server connection to maintain the state and make it behave like a real application. All right, so what that means to us is this whole concept of Web API and what is that. So let's really do this. What is Web API? And this is the kind of stuff you guys should do when you're not sure. Why not? You got Google, right? And see what it says. So let's take a look once again at what Wikipedia says. And I want you to read this carefully here. It says, a web API is an application programming interface. Now, API implies that meaning, right? But what does that really mean, right? So you'll go to websites. For example, if you're a developer and you want to write an application to interface with Facebook, Facebook has an API, meaning they have a bunch of software interfaces already created, a bunch of code that's already created, that if you know how to leverage that code and call their methods and their classes and their objects, you can do stuff with the Facebook website that you couldn't do on your own because they've written the interface for you. Here's the API, here's the commands you call, how you use them, the parameters that you pass, and the data that you'll get back. So it allows you to build maybe an application where Facebook is built right into it. You can like and post directly from your website or directly from your application. So, I mean, that's the kind of ability it gives you. In terms of Web API, this is a technology that was kind of bundled with HTML5. And when you read up on HTML5, usually you'll find like a little blurb about it. And most books really don't delve into it very deeply. In fact, there's not a lot of content out there to really draw from. It's mostly web-based. You know, that's one of the catch-22s about it. But notice that this is an API that'll work either server-side or client-side. So it's not just a client-side technology. It works on both ends of the platform, which is why you see it in a .NET book where we're working with C# on the back end. Because we do have a server-side language and we have the client-side language. They're going to be kind of working together. But notice how they identify here. It is a web development concept, almost more so than a technology, usually limited to the client side, depending on the framework that's on the back end. All right. Now, if you start like digging into it, I know they have a little graphic here somewhere. I thought they did. Okay. Maybe I'm not looking at the right page. Either way. There's a little diagram that they had. Maybe it was in the search results. You know, yeah, actually this is, let's take a look at just a really quick little example here. So in other words, the Web API is kind of like this little software interface that sits in between and really kind of allows us, regardless of device and platform, to work intermittently with our server and our data structures, and then passing the data back in formats that is useful to whatever platform that we're working with. And because of that capability, state is maintained, and we have capabilities to do some really interesting things. So I think rather than kind of like detail them by talking, let's go ahead and start building the chapter 22 or section 22 tutorial. So we're going to work on part 11 here. We start on page 198 in the document, which I already do have up on screen here. So right off the bat, you guys are going to see that we will be creating a new project, and we'll be choosing a couple of different selections here. So we're using not the MVC boxes anymore. We're actually moving on to something else. So I'm going to move this off to the second screen. If your Visual Studio is up and running, let's get working. All right, so Visual Studio is up on the screen for me. I'm going to go ahead, choose a new project. As is typical, we will be working with the ASP.NET regular web application selection. Make sure that you choose a location that makes sense. This one they're calling Web API demo, so I'm going to follow suit and call it the same thing. Yes, I'm putting it out on my OneDrive as I have been the whole semester. And then once you've made that selection, leave that up on the screen for just a second. We're still in C# mode. Go ahead and say OK. Now when you get to the second screen, here's where we start to make a different choice. So now instead of selecting MVC, and you notice that we do have a Web API template here, but you notice what the document asks us to do. They actually ask us to not choose that approach. But here's what I'm going to do really quick is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to build one like this. You guys don't have to follow in my footsteps right now. But I'm going to go ahead and build this and launch it. So I just want you to see what it creates that's different when we create the one with the pre-built template versus what we're about to build. Because the tutorial document does usually err on the side of simplicity so that we can just get to the main points of what we're doing as opposed to like worry about the whole infrastructure of the site. So I'm just going to do this just to show you. And then I'm not going to select MVC down here, but I am going to select, oh wow, do you see like what happens? So why these technologies are often talked about together is because we still use Model View Controller in Web API. So this is a modern approach, so it's just considered integral to the whole process. So I'm going to go ahead and build this out. You guys do not have to follow this step right now, okay? I think you're catching on to that. And then as soon as this is done, I want you to take a look at the resources that become available folder-wise in the project. That's really kind of the key takeaway here. All right, so you see that the project is now built. You see a lot of the folders that you've seen already, right? So it looks really, really similar to the MVC structure. So you do see controllers and models and views. You do see all of those folders. And are there things already built? You betcha. There sure are. There's already an index view started. Some things that are slightly different. Notice that we have a thing called areas and another one called content. And you guys have already learned that content is like where we put like weird things like CSS and other things like that. Why that? I don't know. Somebody just made that choice at some point and put that moniker on it. I'm sure they had a reason for it. Doesn't necessarily make sense to me. But sometimes when you're looking for things, you might not find them in the usual places. But you can see that Bootstrap is wrapped up into this whole thing just as much as anything else is. Also notice that there's a fonts folder, right? That kind of goes with the whole Bootstrap thing. And then, of course, the scripts folder where we see a lot of the Bootstrap and the jQuery stuff that's just automatically thrown into the project. What I'm going to just do now is I'm going to go ahead and launch this project just to give you an idea of what it looks like. And you'll notice when it launches, and if you guys have maybe are following along and maybe doing it anyhow, the look that we get on the main page, which is, did everybody do it? Okay. So let's not spoil the surprise then. Well, we're building it on Bootstrap, right? So it looks just like the regular site that we've been building here. There's just a little bit of different technology driving it. That's kind of the whole point. All right. I'm going to go ahead and close the browser, kill this project, not kill it, but close it. And now, of course, I named this Web API demo, which I shouldn't have, right? I probably should, demo 2 or something. It doesn't really matter much. Let's go back, and now we're going to follow the book instructions where we're going to use the empty project. However, so here, I'll do it like this. Lowercase API demo. We'll call it 2 anyhow. And then on this next screen, we're going to choose empty, but now we are going to select the tools for Web API. So really by choosing empty, what we're doing is we're not putting in that bootstrap stuff. We're not throwing in some of the JavaScript libraries just by default. But we are using Web API in essence because really those core references are present. All right, so once you have that selected, go ahead. Now you can see with that stuff not included, you see there's no controllers folder, there's no views folder. You're noticing that, right? So none of that overhead came with. But before we can do anything in the project here, they would like us in step number 6, the bottom of page 199, to go ahead and add a model. So we're going to right click here, choose add, and then we're going to choose class. From the class dialog, we just want to make sure that class is selected, and then we're of course going to call this employee because that seems like what we're calling everything in this tutorial. So we're calling it employee, and we're going to go ahead and click add, and then that's going to create a model file inside our models folder. All right, moving on to page 201, step number 8. They want us to add some properties inside here, and basically what we're going to do here is using a code-first approach. Remember, we're in the models folder, okay? We're throwing in a class file. We're going to define data fields for a database table. That's what we're doing. And it's going to be basically the same thing that we've done before. So if you want to type them in manually, please feel free. I'll type the first one manually, and then I will quickly revert to copy-paste. And if you guys are smart, you probably are already there. So we're doing our getting a set for an ID, and then of course there's 3 more fields, same ones that we saw before. So it's really nothing new. They're just showing you a different way to do it. So once again, a name, the joining date, and age. All of them have getters and setters. All of them have their data types listed. Go ahead and do a Control S on this to save it. Now we're going to move up to the controllers folder, and we're going to right click, choose add, and then select controller. That should be right at the top of the list. Now, instead of choosing an MVC controller, I want you guys to notice real carefully here. Yep, just to repeat, Tom, I went to the controllers folder, did a right click, add, and then controller. When this dialog comes up, please notice that there are MVC controllers that we can add, like the ones that we've been using all along. Now we're adding Web API controllers, which pulls upon a different set of libraries and DLL files to do the work. We are going to select an empty one to begin with. So choose Web API 2, controller empty. Now, of course, the question you should have is, well, if this is Web API 2, what happened to Web API 1? Well, it's still out there, but when you're building new projects, you go off the newest version. That's really what it is. All right, go ahead and click add. We're going to call the controller employee controller, or employees controller per the tutorial. Go ahead and click add. And then, of course, that's going to generate a C# file for us. And then really quick look at some of the libraries that are being added in here. And notice that there's, at least in what I have on my screen, there's a little bit of a difference. I'm noticing that I have the using system, the collections generic, the link, the .NET. Well, actually the book doesn't show .NET. It does show systemweb.http. And that's the library that pulls in all the Web API stuff. The one thing that I do notice that's a little bit different here is in mine, in the tutorial document, I do not have this. And I'm just going to go ahead and type it in because I know that if I don't, what's it going to do? It's going to call in or underline for me until I add it. And yes, I'm realizing that this is different than what's in the book. Now the reason for that is, right, because the book, they didn't put the number 2 in their title. Do you see conceptually what's happening here? We're calling our document back on itself. That's what's happening. That's why when we're saying using Web API demo 2.models, the book, of course, doesn't have the 2 in there, but that's not what they named theirs. I name mine differently. Now inside here, the question, Tom? And then the question that we just had in the room was, one of my students was typing this in up here, but he didn't have the 2 down here, so of course it threw an error. So these names, whatever they are, this has to match this. Okay. Now inside the class declaration below, between the curly brackets, we have a little bit of work we're going to add in. And basically what we're going to do here is we're going to be feeding information in. And if you guys noticed the code that's on page 203, that's the code that we need to insert in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab all of it in one fell swoop. If my mouse will allow me. You guys can't see this on the second screen, of course, but in principle, at least. All right, so one more time on my copy paste here. And then inside here, I'm going to paste in this code, and hopefully it pastes in cleanly. We'll find out in just a second, I suppose. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and just clean this up a little bit. So I want you to notice the structures that we're creating here. So looks like we're building an employee array called employees. So we're instantiating that. And then inside there, we're going to declare, or instantiate is really the correct word here, several new employees that will go into the structure. Notice the format in which these are being added. So we're declaring a new employee, just brute force. We're not giving it a variable name. We're just putting it in, giving it an ID, name, a joining date, which is being parsed back to a string, and an age. And then that whole structure closes. And I think the book has it laid out kind of like this. I mean, really, these are all one line of code, as you can see from the little return glyph that I have in there. The next method here is the Ienumerable, where we're just going to be returning the employees. And then some additional code here, which is the part that is actually doing like the web API work, if you want to think of it that way. And I'm just trying to make the layout here look exactly like what's in the book. So I don't know if you guys want to go through that trouble or not, but why not? That way, at least if you're looking at the example, you got something you can follow. And hopefully the syntax of it all is good. If so, no underlines, go ahead and save your work. All right. There's a good chance that if you are getting underlines, check the structure of your curly brackets. When I did the copy paste from the tutorial, I'll just show you what I highlighted here. Everything from the employee array declaration up through the third last curly bracket, with the last two curly brackets here already pre-existing in the work, so that's why you didn't need to copy paste them in. You guys good? So a couple things you guys really want to be mindful of here, kind of, problems you may run into. The one is that these lines here really are all one line of text. So don't get into the temptation of doing this. Not that the code's not going to work, but really that's not really what the format is. The other thing that you want to make sure is how you structure these files. Remember that the model file is the structure for your data, and therefore whatever tables get built in databases, whether they're temporary ones or not, those are the data structures. All right, now we're going to go ahead and just take a real quick look at these other methods here at the bottom, and most notably this one here. And notice the name of this, HTTP action result. And what's this going to do? It's going to basically pull back information based upon ID from the database for each individual entry in the table or the data structure, however you want to look at it. And then it's going to say to us, if we don't have any employees, right, that's the if statement, it's going to return not found. What's not found? Not found is something that's already, it's a pre-built method, right? It's just, hey, nothing's in the database, sorry, no luck here. Or it's actually going to go through and return okay, and whatever employee is currently there. So what this is really going to do is it's going to walk through whatever data that we have. And notice we've already built the data up here, right? And it's going to put that back up on the screen for us. Now, what's enlightening about this is the format it uses to output it. This is what's important. Go ahead and run the application. So get your web server running. Let it come up in the browser. It's so convenient this week. It comes up on my main screen instead of my second screen. Still haven't figured out what the correlation is there necessarily. And then we do actually need to specify here a URL. So don't freak out to this error screen. So go ahead and type in employees. Boy, batting 1,000 there. So API employees. And then notice what we get back. Okay, like you guys probably go like that. Okay, right? What the heck is this? All right, well, what the heck this is, folks? What is it? What are we looking at? Can anybody tell me what we're looking at? I'll zoom it a little bit because it says right in the first line what it is. Yeah, it's taking the stuff that's in our data model that we're like hard coding in really, and it's outputting it as XML. All right, so now you're going to say, great, what use is that to me? Here's the use to you. The output that we've created in XML format, XML is a format that can be read in by a bunch of different technologies. So it's not like what we created here it's not like visually impressive, but we have put data into a format that is structured as an XML file and therefore can be inserted into a database. It can be used to create RSS feeds. It could create other application input, etc. But really, it's one step above actually being in a database, and it is in an XML format. Yes, if I had CSS designed for it, for this particular output, I could make it look beautiful. But this is what's interesting about XML. By default, XML browsers do not know how to render XML. It's not like HTML where you put a paragraph tag on it and it knows what to do with it, because all the tags that are output are our own tags that we created. So the only way that those render to the screen is if we write CSS to handle them. Now, that's not the point of XML, though. XML is really like the universal markup language. We can use it to feed information into just about anything. That's the important takeaway, including output to the screen, but more importantly, feeding it into a different application component or into a database. So you're catching the importance of it here. If we went ahead and we appended to the URL 1, right? So we're passing a parameter, basically, and press enter. Of course, it finds the person with the ID of 1 and shows us just that 1, right? Granted, XML format, not looking pretty, but we're able basically to query the data based upon that ID. All right, so that's just a really quick and simple little example from our tutorial document on how Web API works. Very simplistic. Now we're going to switch over and we're going to work on the Microsoft tutorial that I have linked up inside of our Unit 9 folder. So before we do that, I think it's an opportune time to take a short break here in class. I'm not going to record a different video. We'll do them both in the same video. And we'll come back and pick up in a few minutes. All right, folks, we're back from our break, and we're going to be working on the second assignment now in Unit 9, which is the Web API tutorial for Microsoft. And I'm doing this as a little bit of a trial balloon, as I mentioned before. I haven't tried this one in a classroom setting, so we'll see how it goes. But I think there's a little bit of value in this compared to what we just did, which is pretty simplistic. And it comes at it from a slightly different perspective, so you can see a little bit of a different approach. All right, inside the assignment listing itself, there is a link to the tutorial, which I already have open in a tab up above, but no harm done. I'll go ahead and click on it. The one thing I do want you to notice is they do have a completed version that you could download in advance if you wanted to do code comparison. But I would actually implore you to just try to build it from the ground up, following along. I do want you to notice that this one is built using Visual Studio 2017 and Web API version 2, which is the one that we just used for the other tutorial. All right, and let's read what they have to say here, which is kind of, it's pretty brief, but it does provide, I think, some good information. It says, HTTP is not just for serving up web pages. HTTP is also a powerful platform for building APIs that expose services and data, which is kind of what we just did in the previous one, right? We were able to extract data from a model and put it up on the screen. HTTP is simple, flexible, and ubiquitous. Almost any platform that you can think of has an HTTP library, so HTTP services can reach a broad range of clients, including browsers, mobile devices, and traditional desktop applications. And that really, in a nutshell, is kind of what it's all about. The fact that you can use it on just about any kind of device that's web connected. So we think phones, tablets, computers, right? But don't forget game systems, Roku's, television sets, think of anything that's internet connected. Heck, your thermostat, right? Your doorbell, right? I know more and more people have those silly little devices. And it says ASP.NET Web API is a framework for building web APIs on top of the .NET framework so that we can leverage C# basically on the whole .NET library system. So in this tutorial, you're going to use the Web API to create a Web API that returns a list of products. So nothing particularly fancy, but a little bit different than what we just did. Okay, so notice that this is kind of the result that we're shooting for here. Very simple little page. And notice we'll be able to search for things. So go ahead and make sure that you have your Visual Studio up and running. I would recommend, if you have this other Web API demo, that you go ahead and close that and get that off your screen. And then go ahead and select New Project. And then I'm going to pull this, as I always do, off to the second screen to follow it. Back over to Visual Studio. Then we're going to go ahead and select the ASP.NET application framework like we always do. Make sure it's C# in the web category. And we're not using the core version. We're still using the web application. version. I'm trying to read what it says here. It looks like they're calling it Products App for the name of the application. So I'm going to do the same. Products App. I am putting it out on my OneDrive as I normally do. And then I'm going to go ahead and click OK. From the next screen, they're instructing us to choose an empty template, so we're not using Bootstrap or anything like that. That's really kind of most of what's happening. Do make sure that you click Web API as a selection for the folders and core references. I'm not worried about authentication at this point. All right, the project is now created, and we're going to begin by adding a model. And the reason we're doing this, of course, is if we have some sort of data structure, that's going to be kind of the main driver of this application, to pull in product data. So we need to have that kind of built. If you read the instructions here, or actually the description, and actually I'll pull it back over because I think they do a nice job of explaining it here. So let's just read it and see what they say. It says a model is an object that represents the data in your application. And I like the way that's phrased, actually. It's probably better than I've said it all class long. But it is a representation of your data, not necessarily the data itself. ASP.NET Web API can automatically serialize your model to JSON, XML, or some other format. The format that we just did was what? XML, the output, as evidenced by the browser output. And then it can write that serialized data into the body of an HTTP response message. So it just uses the standard HTTP protocol to push the stuff back to the screen. As long as the client can read the serialization format, it can deserialize it and put it up on the screen, basically. Most clients can parse either XML or JSON, or both. And moreover, the client can indicate which format it wants by setting the accept header in the HTTP request method. All right, so it says let's start by creating a simple model. And we all know how to do that, so we're going to right-click that models folder. And then we're going to choose add. And then we're going to create a class. Make sure that class is selected. And then we are going to create a product class. Go ahead and click add. And then just like we did with the employees, we are just going to add some simple text here. And the one thing that's kind of neat about working with this type of website is notice they have the little ability here. We can just copy this code and paste it in if you want. And I already have most of that structure, so I'm not going to do that. But I am just going to highlight the pieces I need here and then just paste them in. Paste in beautifully. Do a Control S to save that. All right, so now notice we are creating a data model that has an ID, a name, a category, and a price. All of them have their data type set, and we have getters and setters for each one. All right, now we need to put in a controller so that we can handle the requests coming from the browser to make sure that things happen the way that we intend. So in this case, we'll need to go to the controllers folder, right-click, add a controller. The one thing that they're making a little note here in the little blurb box where it says, note, if you've used ASP.NET MVC, you're already familiar with controllers. Web API controllers are similar, but inherit a different class. So they inherit from API controller instead of controller. So different methods are basically available. All right, so here we're going to choose Web API 2 controller, an empty one. Click Add. We're going to name this Products Controller. Go ahead and click Add once again, and it's going to start the scaffolding process. And then within a few moments, we have a Products Controller class file inside of our controllers folder. We do make a little note here as well. It says you don't need to put your controllers into a folder named controllers. You can put it anywhere as long as your application can find it. That's just a convention that we use. All right, now we need to do some tweaks to this file. First of all, let's begin by taking a look at all of our imports up here at the top, our using statements. Notice that we have to do the same thing here that we did in the other Web API file. We have to connect to the model that we built within our application. So we need to add here a statement. And they have it at the top. It, truly it doesn't matter where you put it. So right here, we're going to just type in products app, that's us, our app, and the models that we already have defined. And we're just importing that into this file, so anything that's there, the data fields we created there, are brought in and will recognize by name. And then using very much the same approach here, we're going to build, if not identical, I'm looking at this and it's like practically identical, folks, to what we just did. So here's the kind of the fun part. I'm going to pull this in piece by piece. First, we're going to predefine our data. So I grab this little section of it right here. So we're pulling together an array called products. Inside that, we're going to instantiate a number of new entries. So we're hard coding data into it, names, categories, and the price. All right. Next part of it is similar to what we did before. So I'm going to grab the next two methods. And you'll notice how basically identical this is to what we just did. You guys catching that? What's going to be different here, though, is how we output it. Once again, creating a model, hard coding data, and then having a way to be able to pull the stuff back, provided there is something to pull back, and to be able to pull it back based on ID number. All right. The methods here, get all products. Of course, that's going to return everything that's there. And then get product, where we're passing in a value, that's going to just look for that parameter that we pass, the ID number. And here it's going to be ID 1, 2, or 3 again, right? Because that's what we defined, right? Could be a list of 1,000 items, but in this case, it's a list of 3. Now, the other thing that's going to be interesting here, of course, I'm doing Control-S to save, is the URL that's going to be generated is going to be similar again to what we just did. So whatever the root application is, we're going to append to it API, to pull in all the API methods, the name of the controller, what's the controller we just created, products, and then if we choose to add an ID after it, which will then pull in and give us what we're expecting. I want you to notice that we're using this keyword get in front. That's not going to be part of the URL. The other thing that's not going to be part of the URL is get all. So the engine kind of intelligently works with this MVC stuff, this smart URL routing. So all that we're going to add to the URL is products, either without a parameter or with a parameter. And then notice that it intelligently will figure out which one to call. So no parameter brings in everything. Include a parameter, tries to find the one you're specifying. All right, make sure that that file is saved. All right, so now I'm moving on to the section called Calling the Web API with JavaScript and Jquery. So here's a little bit different approach than what we did before. We're going to go ahead and click on the very root of your solution. And I don't mean like up here, but the bolded name of your project, one step down, that's really the root of this project. And we're going to do a right click, an add, and then we're going to select new item. All right. Now underneath here, we're going to go to the web section. We are in C# mode. And then we're going to select HTML page. So our output, instead of just letting it like create an XML file and throw it on the screen, which is what happened last time, that's not what we're shooting for here. We want it to go to an actual web page this time. So this is really kind of a cool approach, right? Pretty simple, but pretty cool. All right, go ahead and name the page. Guess what? Index.html. And then go ahead and click add. And then it creates like the basic structure of an HTML5 page with nothing in it, of course. Now we are going to look at the code that they have, and we're going to replace their document with the code that you see here. Now I'm going to be really kind of careful about this, and I'm going to like paste it in pieces. If you guys want to do it in one fell swoop, that's fine. But I'm doing it in pieces so I can do it a little explanation to go with it. First of all, we're going to add an XML namespace to the document. Let's talk about that. You'll notice that the XML namespace here is attributed to which version of HTML? XHTML. Right. Now this happens in a lot of web-based applications when you're interfacing with data components on the back end, and when there's a back end language involved and then you need to push content into it. Sometimes if you don't have this namespace put in, the framework is not strict enough to allow you to push content into it and not have the application break. So one thing that you might notice if you're not changing this piece is without this little namespace declaration, the whole thing might not work. Okay? And we are working with HTML5, but we're using an XHTML namespace. The difference is basically that XHTML has got a stricter rule set than HTML does. And that is better for application development. So that's why it is included here. They want us to put in a title, product app. I am noticing that they don't have the character set defined. I don't see any reason to not leave it, so I'm leaving it. And then we're going to start to drop in just some regular HTML. So the first thing they do is they drop in a couple of divs, right? Just a little layout. So you got an H2. They got an unordered list. And I want you to look at this. This is kind of weird, right? You probably have never done that before, right? You usually, when you see a UL, you know, you're closing it separately, right? You're doing that. So what is the point then, I'm kind of questioning you, of putting it in this format where it's a self-closing tag? Here's the thinking behind it. I've created a structure with an ID. My application will be able to inject data directly into that unordered list and then build the rest of the structure automatically for us. So this is really what we're creating is a container. In this case, they chose a UL, but it doesn't have to be a UL. It could be whatever you want. You want a paragraph, you want another div, you know, whatever. It doesn't matter. But this is what they chose. So that's going to give us a bulleted list. Notice that the same thing is happening down here. Paragraph. with a self-closing tag. That self-closing tag, by the way, that's one of those things from XHTML, where HTML5 would allow you to do the same thing without the closing tag. But a lot of applications won't work that way. So it looks like this one. All right, so with this little section, you can see that we're going to have a couple input boxes, a button, and a text box where we can type in the ID number to search for it. That's the point of that. The paragraph is provided, once again, empty paragraph with an ID. It's the container where we can inject content. That's what it exists for. Okay, next part of the code is adding some JavaScript. So the first part, we're going to pull in a link to the jQuery libraries. Now I know that one thing that we could have done here is I could have run the NuGet package manager and added jQuery directly to my project, right? And there is that mindset. Okay, and I'm going to tell you, whenever I did development professionally, I would never use that approach. I was never a fan of taking all the jQuery files that are already out on the internet that I can link to and dropping them into my project and wasting, frankly, the disk space to load, even though it's not a lot of files. Why? Here's the thinking. If you use the libraries that are already out there, and you can see here, they're pulling in the jQuery library from some, ASP.NET, CDN.com. But most often when people are connecting to jQuery, they're usually pulling it in either directly from the jQuery site or from the Google APIs. And the thinking is that most users out there surfing the internet already have those libraries cached in their browser. So it's just going to run that much faster because it's already there. And whose server is faster, Google's or Microsoft's or yours? And that's a pretty easy one to answer. So why drop in the libraries when I can link to them? Doesn't matter, right? As long as you can get to them. The next section is all the JavaScript. And that I'm going to grab as one big chunk and drop it all in at once. And then we'll kind of like walk back through and take a look at what it's doing. So we pulled in the jQuery libraries, and then we are setting up, to begin with, a URI. And now hold on a second. What is a URI versus a URL? First of all, what does URI stand for as an acronym? Thanks for all jumping in at once, class. A URI is a universal resource indicator as opposed to a universal resource locator, right? The second one is the actual address. The first one is not. It indicates the type of content that we're working with, not the location of the content. That's the difference. Okay, so notice that we are basically presetting it so that we're going to have this URL, sorta. And notice how they're using URI. It's an indicator of where our stuff is going to be found. Okay. All right. Then we see some traditional jQuery. You guys are all familiar with jQuery to some degree, right? You guys know it's a JavaScript library. You can tell you're working with jQuery because you see a $sign at the beginning. And whenever you see that $sign, you know that what follows it inside of parentheses is some form of CSS selector that grabs whatever object on the screen that we're working with, and then following a dot, the methods that we're applying to it or what we're doing with it, right? And it's really a way to accelerate development pretty significantly. Notice that what we're doing here is we're actually using an AJAX request. So what we're doing is from a stateless web page, one that does not maintain your state, we are requesting information from the application. Now, from a conceptual standpoint, if this was running on a server, our application would be compiled on a server with its database and its data and all the stuff that goes with it. And what we would call the page, we want to pull information from our data store. We're connecting to a remote server and pulling it back. As we work on our own machines here in development mode, that's all happening on our machine. But if it was out on the web, that call for data would go to the server, get the data, pull it back without changing the web page. This is really a pretty critical thing. Loading the information without refreshing the page. Okay, huge. It's really a pretty important thing. And that's all done with the technology called Ajax, which originally was built on XML, like what we just saw. In this case, notice the format that we're using. JSON. So we're going to bring back serialized key value pair JavaScript. That's going to feed in from the server. So it's going to pull in that information, and then it's going to go through and figure out where the stuff is. And if, as long as there's a record, it's going to go through and create a list item for us. See what it's doing? So for each item, it's going to create a list item. It's going to bring back, it's going to unserialize that information and then insert it into something that's got an ID of products. So it's going to start creating that unordered list of products for us. That's what this part's doing. Next thing that happens is we're going to start to format some of these things where we are going to return the name of the item. We're going to insert a $sign and a colon before it, and then put the price on the screen. That's all this part's doing. Format item. So wherever we're calling format item, it's just taking it and putting it in a format that we can read it. And then we also have a find function, which grabs the ID that we're sending in. So notice how it's grabbing the product ID, and that's a selector. So if you went back and you looked at your code here, right, see the input field? What's its ID? Product ID. So it's taking the text from the text box, and it's feeding it the value that's in the text box. It's feeding it into this variable, and then we're going to start looking for that ID. And notice what's going to happen is we're going to get that JSON information from API products / that ID. So what is it doing? It's building the URL for us. That's what the find function is doing. So when we type the number in there for the ID that we're searching, it's putting it into a URL, we hit the button, and it searches. If it finds it, then it's going to output it, right? And that's what the first part does. If it fails, if it does not find it, who created these? Those are built into jQuery, folks. If it's done, it puts it on the screen. If it fails, it gives us an error message automatically. All right, that's kind of the crux of it all. All right. I know that's a lot of explanation for a little bit of code, but pretty important. Do a Control-S to save, so you got your index.html saved. And what they do next in the tutorial, see, and I got to show you this, right? Because so whoever wrote this probably thinks like I do a little bit. And they go through and they show you all the code, and then they walk through and they tell you what each one does, which is what I just did. I didn't even plan it that way. But believe it or not, they want you to understand it. So if you don't have somebody like me talking at you the whole time, you have some way to get the explanation. So now we're going to go ahead. Let's go ahead and run this. So I'm going to fire up the internal web server here. There's only one page it can possibly launch, so it's going to launch the index page. Now this time it came up on screen number 2. Here it is. So this is what came up. Correct? Okay. So now, did you notice as I did that? I'm going to do a refresh. All right. It took a moment to get the products up on the screen. Did you guys notice that? Yeah. Do you know why? It's still building the database on the back end. Because the first run. Right? So now the products are there with the price. And then if I want to search by ID, let's start by putting in one we know doesn't exist. Let's put in the number 4 and press enter. Or actually, search. Okay, tells you it's not found. Let's put in one where we know it is there. Click the button. And it pulls it back. Now here's the important takeaway here. In the first example, we looked at moving XML data. Okay? So we were able to do that. Now we're moving JSON data. But watch what happens when I type in any value here and hit the search button. Normally, when you refresh a page, and I don't know if you guys noticed this, but if you, and I don't know if it'll show up in the video really, but notice when I hit the refresh button, watch this icon up here. Watch it. Notice how it flashes? Shows you that it refreshed or tried to refresh. And often if you're writing a page where you click a button, and even though the screen doesn't seem to change, but that icon flashes, it really did refresh. What you should not be seeing here is when I hit the number 1 to do the search. You guys noticing it's not refreshing? This is AJAX. This is that call back to the server to get the data, pull it right back using JavaScript, dropping it right in place. I didn't need to refresh the page. Why is that important for modern application development? Because that takes a lot of burden off the server, because now you don't have to send the graphics back. You don't have to call the page. You just want one little piece of data. So why should we redraw the whole damn page? See the logic, right? And if you start thinking about this technology, this is what makes a lot of your Google applications happen. Google was onto this stuff 10 years ago, right? Maybe longer for all I know. But being able to create applications that behave like real applications, not needing to redraw the page, but still getting server-side interactions to pull data back. If you ever look at your Gmail, when you pull in a message, right, you get your list of messages, then you click on the message, that's how it operates, folks. They're not redrawing the whole darn screen, just the part they need to redraw. Right, so that's really the example here. Now, if you want to do something that's kind of interesting, and we put in ones that work, we put in ones that don't work. If you want to try that again, you can type in a number we know is not in there, generate the error message. Let's go ahead and do an inspect on this. And the reason that we want to do an inspect is they want us to basically look at some of the things that are happening on the back end. Now, granted, if you go into this developer mode, depending on what browser you're in, what they want you to do is they want you to take a look at a couple different things. First of all, whenever you're running JavaScript, you should be able to look at the console, right? And you know what? You can look at the console as the application is running. So I'm going to put in a value I know is going to work. One that we know isn't going to work. And if you want, you can clear these out, right? How do you clear these out again? All right, we'll leave it. All right, whatever. But if you guys are familiar with the console here, notice that when we do have stuff that succeeds, notice what it does, how it actually shows you what you're calling in and what is being utilized to make it happen. The other piece that they want you to look at is take a look at the network section here. If you want, maybe even expand this a little bit and take a look at the file. So let's start by just refreshing the page. All right, so, the way you get to inspect is, I'm sorry, you just right-click on any open part of the page, and you should have inspect element or inspect, or all of them have that tool now. Do you guys know what browser had that first? Firefox? Now they all have it, right? All right, and then you see here all the stuff that gets loaded, and this is part of the tutorial as well. So it shows you the pages that get loaded. Notice that by reloading the page, you guys see what happens here? That index.html gets pulled in. That took 27 milliseconds. The jQuery pulled in from somebody else's external library. You guys know how many lines of code there are in a jQuery file? There's a lot of code in there, right? And okay, granted, this is a minified file, so it's like on one line or two lines, something like that. Look how quickly that loaded up. Almost instantaneously. So remember I told you that when you're using libraries that are out on the web, good chance are it might already be cached in the browser memory. So that actually loaded faster than my index file, which is on my same machine. Then, of course, products, right? What is this? This is the data model that we're pulling in. So it's pulling in the data component. That took the longest, 36 milliseconds. And they show you, the impact time-wise here. The thing that's kind of interesting that they're trying to point us to is that if you can click on any one of these individual pieces, yeah, you can do that in here. This is kind of fun. This shows you the data that's being pulled back from the server side and fed into the application. Where before we pulled in that XML file, right? We got to actually see the code for it on the screen because that's just what it does. With JSON, though, in order for me to actually see the serialized data, the data that's actually being sent back, I have to come into this interface, but I can actually look at it. Now, why this is useful for you guys as developers is if you guys ever write an application, and you're like, what's it actually sending back? Oh, no wonder it's screwed up. That's kind of the mindset. Or, oh, that's how we have to contend with it. It is showing us exactly what's in that file. Of course, if you click on index, it shows you index, shows you, well, do we really want to look at jQuery? I guess if you want, go for it. But this is the actual serialized data that's being sent back from the application, line by line. So it's showing you the data structure that you're pulling in. Notice JSON format, key value pairs, the key, colon, the value, comma separated, strings of course are in quotes, numbers are just there. Now, when they are working with these technologies, they want you to kind of like, let's really explore this interface, and that's kind of what I'm doing right now. You can see what is being requested, what is being sent back for each one of these things. So if like I click on this products one, it shows what data is actually being sent and what technologies are being used to drive it all. So you can see the versions of the server. Did you guys realize that like if you go on a web page and you really want to figure out what technologies they're using, you can do this. You can look at all the pieces that are coming back on a web page and you can figure out, well, this is running on a Microsoft server, this is that, oh yeah, they're using this technology. It's all there for the taking. Why? Because HTTP, that's how HTTP works. Now, that's kind of scary in a sense, because all of a sudden, just by visiting somebody's web page, you can figure out what technology they're using. Yep. How do you figure that hackers figure out how to get into systems? This is how. They look into these files. And then, of course, if you want to look at what actually comes back, you can see the response. You can see the timing for any particular component. And I think it's just fascinating and depending on which browser you're using, you can actually dig into this even deeper. There's some additional tools that you can use. Okay, so hopefully you guys got a little bit out of this demonstration, see how the technologies work and how we get stuff back up on the screen. But this technique, it's basically an AJAX technique, which works really well with Web API, is really useful for creating a lot of different application things, especially where you don't want to be reloading the page. So think of like creative things that you could do with it, and there's many. And this video ends here, folks.